All the Sinners Bleed. By S.A.Cosby. To my brother, Darrell Cosby. What we know only we could ever know. The belief in a supernatural source of evil is not necessary, men alone are quite capable of every wickedness. Joseph Conrad. Behold, I make all things new. Revelation 21 verse 5. Charon County. Charon County was founded in bloodshed and darkness. Literally and figuratively. Even the name is enveloped in shadows and morbidity. Legend has it the name of the county was supposed to be Charlotte or Charles County, but the town elders waited too late and those names were already taken by the time they decided to incorporate their fledgling encampment. As the story goes, they just moved their finger down the list of names until they settled on Charon. Those men, weathered as whitleather with hands like splitting mauls, bestowed the name on their new town with no regard to its macabre nature. Or perhaps they just liked the name because a river flowed through the county and emptied into the Chesapeake like the river Styx. Who knows? Who could know the thoughts of those long-dead men? What is known is that in 1805 in the dead of night a group of white landowners, chafing at the limits of their own manifest destiny, set fire to the last remaining indigenous village on the teardrop-shaped peninsula that would become Charon County. Those who escaped the flames were brought down by muskets with no regard to age, gender, or infirmity. That was the first of many tragedies in the history of Charon. The cannibalism of the winter of 1853. The malaria outbreak of 1901. The United Daughters of the Confederacy picnic poisoning of 1935. The Danforth family murder-suicide of 1957. The tent revival baptismal drownings of 1968, and on and on. The soil of Charon County, like most towns and counties in the South, was sown with generations of tears. They were places where violence and mayhem were celebrated as the pillars of a pioneering spirit every Founders' Day in the county square. Blood and tears. Violence and mayhem. Love and hate. These were the rocks upon which the South was built. They were the foundation upon which Charon County stood. If you had an occasion to ask some of the citizens of Charon, most of them would tell you those things were in the past. That they had been washed away by the river of time that flows ever forward. They might even say those things should be forgotten and left to the ages. But if you had asked Sheriff Titus Crown, he would have said that anyone who believed that was a fool or a liar. Or both. And if you had an occasion to speak with him after that long October, he would have told you that maybe the foundation of Charon was rotten and fetid and full of corruption, not only corruption of the flesh but of the soul. That maybe the rocks the South was built upon were shifting and splitting like the stone Moses struck with his staff. But instead of water, only blood and ichor would come pouring forth. He might touch the scars on his face or his chest absent-mindedly and lock eyes with you and say in that harsh whisper that was now his speaking voice. The South doesn't change. You can try to hide the past, but it comes back in ways worse than the way it was before. Terrible ways. He might sigh and look away and say, the South doesn't change, just the names and the dates and the faces, and sometimes even those don't change, not really. Sometimes it's the same day and the same faces waiting for you when you close your eyes. Waiting for you in the dark. 1. Titus woke up 5 minutes before his alarm went off at 7 a.m. and made himself a cup of coffee in the Keurig Darlene had gotten him last Christmas. At the time she'd given it to him he'd thought it was an expensive gift for a relationship that was barely 4 months old. These days, Titus had to admit it was a damn good gift that he was grateful to have. He'd gotten her a bottle of perfume. He almost winced thinking back on it. If knowing your lover was a competition, Darlene was a gold medalist. Titus didn't even qualify for the bronze. Over the last 10 months he'd forced himself to get exponentially better in the gift-giving department. Titus sipped his coffee. His last girlfriend before Darlene had said he was a great boyfriend but was awful at relationships. He didn't dispute that assessment. Titus took another sip. He heard the stairs creak as his father made his way down to the kitchen. That mournful cry of ancient wood had gotten him and Marquis in trouble on more than one late Friday night until Titus stopped staying out late and Marquis stopped coming home. "Hey, while you standing there in your boxers, make me one of them their fancy cups out that machine," Albert Crown said. Titus watched his father limp over to the kitchen table and ease himself down into one of their vinyl-covered metal chairs that would drive a hipster interior designer mad with nouveau retro euphoria. It had been a year since his father's hip replacement and Albert still walked with a studied caution. He stubbornly refused to use a cane, but Titus saw the way his smooth brown face twisted into tight Gordian knots when a rainstorm blew in off the bay or when the temperature started to drop like a lead sinker. Albert Crown had made his living on that bay for 40 years, hauling in crab pots 6 days a week, 14 hours a day off the shore of Piney Island on boats owned by folks who barely saw him as a man. No insurance, no 401k, but all those backbreaking days and the frugality of Titus's mother had allowed them to build a 3-bedroom house on Preach Neck Road. They were the only family, black or white, that had a house on an actual foundation. Envy had crossed the color lines and united their neighbors as the house rose from the forest of mobile homes that surrounded it like a rose among weeds. "When we retire, we can sit on the front step in matching rocking chairs and wave to Patsy Jones as she drives by rolling her eyes," Titus's mother Helen had told his father at the kitchen table one night during one of those rare weekends his father wasn't out gallivanting down at the watering hole or Grace's place. Titus put a cup in the Keurig, slid a pod in the filter, and set the timer. But, like so many things in life, his mother's gently petty retirement plan was not meant to be. She died long before she could ever retire from the Cunningham flag factory. Patsy Jones was still driving by and rolling her eyes, though. "Which one you put in there?" Albert asked. He opened the newspaper and started running his finger over the pages. Titus could see his lips move ever so slightly. His mother had been the more adventurous reader, but his father never let the sun set on the day without going through the newspaper. "Hazelnut. The only one you like," Titus said. Albert chuckled. "Don't you tell that girl that. She got us that value pack. That was nice of her." He licked his finger and turned the page. As soon as he did, he sucked his teeth and grunted. "Them rebellish boys don't never let up, do they? Now they gonna have a goddamn parade for that statue. Them boys just mad somebody finally had the nerve to tell them they murdering traitor of a granddaddy won't shit," Albert spat. "Ricky Sowers and them sons of the Confederacy boys been knocking down the door of my office for the past 2 weeks, Titus said. He took another sip. "What for?" Albert asked. "They want to make sure the sheriff's office will fulfill its duties and maintain crowd control in case any protesters show up. You know, since Ricky is Caucasian, I'm biased against them because of my cultural background," Titus said. He kept his voice flat and even, the way he'd learned in the bureau, but he caught his father's eyes over the top of the newspaper. Albert shook his head. "That Sowers boy wouldn't have said that to Ward Bennings. Hell, Ward would have probably marched with M with his star on his chest. Cultural background. Shit. He means 'cause you a black man and he a racist." "Lord, son, I don't know how you do it sometimes," Albert said. "Easy. I just imagine Sherman kicking their murderous traitorous great-granddaddies in the teeth." "That's my zen," Titus said. His voice stayed flat, but Albert burst out laughing. "Down at the store last Friday, Linwood Lassiter asked one of the boys with the sticker on his truck why don't they put a statue to, what's that boy name? The one with them eggs?" Albert said. "Benedict Arnold?" Titus offered. "Yeah, build a statue to that boy, since they like traitors so goddamn much." That boy said something about heritage and history and Linwood said all right, how about a statue to Nat Turner? That boy got in his truck and spun tires and rolled coal on us. But he didn't have an answer, Albert said. Titus narrowed his eyes. "You get a license plate number? What the truck look like?" Nah, we was too busy laughing. It looks like every truck them kind of boys drive. Jacked up to the sky and not a lick of dirt in the bed. They do them trucks just like some of them fellas that come up on the bay in them big fancy boats but don't never catch no fish. Use a working man's tools for toys, Albert said. Titus finished his coffee. He rinsed out the cup and set it in the sink. They don't care about Benedict Arnold, Pop. He didn't hate the same people they do. I'm gonna go get dressed. I'm on till 9. There's still some beef stew left from Sunday in the refrigerator. You can have that for supper, Titus said. Boy, I ain't so old I can't make my own supper. Who taught you how to cook anyway? Albert asked. Titus felt a tight smile work its way across his face. You did, he said. But, Titus thought, not until Mama had been in the ground and you'd finally found Jesus. Damn right. I mean, I'll probably eat the stew, but I can still turn up something in the kitchen, Albert said with a wink. Titus shook his head and headed for the stairs. Maybe I'll get some oysters and we can put some fire to that old grill this weekend. Get your trifling brother to come over, Albert said as Titus put his foot on the first step. Titus stiffened for a moment before continuing up the stairs. Marquis wasn't coming over this or any other weekend. The fact that his father still clung to the idea was at various times depressing and infuriating. Marquis worked for himself as a self-taught carpenter. He stayed on the other side of the county in the Windy River Trailer Park, but he might as well have been in Nepal. Even though he made his own hours, they could go months without seeing him. In a place as small as Charon County, that was a dubious achievement. Titus went into his bedroom and opened his closet. His everyday clothes were on wire hangers on the left. His uniforms were on wooden hangers on the right. He didn't refer to his everyday clothes as his civilian wardrobe. That gave his uniforms a level of militarization he didn't like. His everyday clothes were color-coordinated and hung in alphabetical order. Blacks first, then blues, then reds, then so on. Darlene had once commented that he was the most organized man she'd ever met. His shoes were ordered in the exact same manner. Kelly, his former girlfriend from his time in Indiana, used to rearrange his clothes whenever she spent the night. She said she did it for his own good. Gotta loosen you up, Virginia. Your wound too tight, one day you're gonna snap. I'm trying to help you with your mental health, she'd say. Titus thought she did it because she knew he hated it. She knew they would argue about it and she also knew they'd make up, furiously. He let out a sigh. Kelly was the past. Darlene was his present. And despite what Faulkner said, that part of his life was done. Best to leave it where he'd left it. He pushed his regular clothes to the left. His uniforms were all on the right side of the closet. They were all the same color. Deep brown shirt, lighter tan brown pants with a dark brown stripe down the leg. He had 2 bulletproof vests that hung at the far right of the closet. 2 pairs of black leather shoes sat on the floor. A brown tricorn hat sat on a shelf. Darlene called it his Smokey the Bear hat. Because you're my big ol' bear, she'd said one night as she lay across his chest. Her fingers playing across the scar on his chest like a pianist playing the scales. The scar was a gift, of sorts, from Red to Crane, white supremacist, Christian nationalist, militia leader, and for 7 minutes a wannabe martyr. Those 7 minutes had changed all their lives. Titus's, Red's, and those of Red's wife and his 3 sons, who all had been outfitted with grenade vests. The youngest boy had only been 7 years old. His vest had hung loose on his shoulders like a hoodie he'd borrowed from one of his brothers. When he'd pulled that pin his face had been as blank as a sheet of notebook paper. Then it had. Stop it, he said out loud to no one. He rubbed his face with both hands. The shrapnel from the explosions had left that question-mark-shaped burned scar on his belly. The scars on his soul were not visible but were no less horrific. Titus put on his uniform in an oft-practiced ritual that calmed him. First he put on the vest and strapped it in place. Then he grabbed his shirt, then a brown necktie that hung next to its two brothers on a hook on the inside of the closet door. Next were his pants, then his shoes. He went to his nightstand, opened the drawer, and grabbed his service belt. He cinched it tight before grabbing the key from the nightstand and carefully dropping to his haunches. A sheriff couldn't be seen in his county with wrinkled pants. A black sheriff had to have an extra pair of pants in his office just in case. He pulled a metal box from under the bed, unlocked the box, and retrieved his service pistol. The county would only pay for a Smith & Wesson 9mm. Titus wanted something with more stopping power. He'd purchased the SIG Sauer P320 out of his own pocket. It was the same sidearm the Virginia State Police used. He checked the clip and the chamber before sliding it in the holster. There were 2 pairs of mirrored sunglasses on top of the nightstand. Titus grabbed one pair and slipped them in his shirt pocket. His radio was on top of the nightstand next to the sunglasses. He picked it up and clipped the transponder to his belt and the mic to his collar. Lastly, he reached in the drawer and grabbed his badge. He pinned it to his shirt above his left pocket and headed down the stairs. Albert was still sitting at the table, but now the newspaper was gone. In its place was an envelope bearing Titus's name. "What's that?" Titus asked, even though he was pretty sure he already knew. "It's been 1 year. Reverend Jackson said last Sunday it was still a miracle worth praising. Who knew Ward Bennings getting hit by a logging truck would mean the first black sheriff of Charon County would win the special election?" Albert said. Titus picked up the envelope. He tore it open with his thumbnail. A greeting card with a comical penguin holding a devilish pitchfork was on the front. On the inside, an inscription read, "Guess hell really froze over, you two are still together. Happy anniversary." Titus raised his eyebrows. "Walmart didn't have a card for being proud of your son for being the first black sheriff this county ever had. But I am proud. My boy back home and changing things. You don't know how much seeing you in that uniform means to people, Titus. If you mama was here, she'd be proud too," Albert said, his voice breaking around the edges. Titus's mother had been gone for 23 years and yet the mere mention of her still wrung heartache from his father like water from a washcloth. Would she be so proud if she knew what had happened in northern Indiana at the DeCrane compound? "I don't think so," Titus thought. "No, I don't think she'd be proud at all. Not all our people are proud. But thanks for the card, Pop," Titus said. "You talking about that Addison boy over at the New Wave Church?" "PSSH, ain't nobody thinking about that boy. He thinks Jesus wears blue jeans," Albert said. It was the worst insult his Pentecostal Baptist father who wore his best suit every Sunday could utter in reference to the dreadlocked New Age minister. "He's doing good work over at that church, Pop," Titus said. "You call that place a church?" "It sounds like a juke joint when you drive past," Albert said. "You don't?" "Anyway, Jamal Addison ain't the only person who thinks I'm an Uncle Tom," Titus said with a rueful smile. "Well, Reverend Jackson always preaching about being aware of false prophets," Albert said. Titus thought that was ironic but didn't say anything. "You know, it would be nice if you came to a service once in a while." "Don't nobody at church think you know damn Uncle Tom," Albert said. "They worked hard for you, Titus. I'm just saying." The amount and depth of his gratitude to Emmanuel Baptist Church for their support of his surprise campaign was a conversation his father kept trying to have and Titus kept trying to avoid. Not because he wasn't grateful. He was well aware it was the support of congregations like Emmanuel that propelled him to the sheriff's office, along with an influx of liberal-minded Latter-day hippies and good old boys and girls who hated Ward Bennings's son Cooter more than they distrusted the former football hero and FBI agent. A rare coalition that wouldn't come together again for a generation. But now everyone had their hands out. His father's church was no different. He knew that the support of his father's congregation came with conditions that he wasn't inclined to meet. Never mind the fact that he hadn't attended an actual church service since he was 15. He'd stopped going about the same time his father had started. 2 years after his mother had died. "I'll let you know, Pop. It's the week before Fall Fest." "You know that's gonna be busy for me," Titus lied. Fall Fest was mainly an excuse for the citizens of Charon County to get drunk and dance in the street before slipping off to some dark corner of the courthouse green for a whiskey-soaked kiss from a lover. Either theirs or someone else's. Albert was about to press his case further when Titus's radio crackled to life. "Titus, come in." The voice on the radio was his dispatcher, Cam Trouter. Cam worked the morning shift and the other dispatcher, Kathy Miller, worked at night. Cam was one of the few holdovers from the previous administration. He was an Iraq War vet who was calm under pressure, who also possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every road and dirt lane in the county. Despite those impressive credentials, Cam's most important attribute was proximity. He lived less than a mile from the sheriff's office. He never missed a day, come rain or shine. His all-terrain electric wheelchair could get up to 20 miles per hour. Cam had souped it up himself with help from a YouTube video and some PDFs he'd downloaded off the internet. The man was nothing if not determined. That was why the sheer hopelessness that seeped from his voice and came spilling out of the radio set Titus's nerves on edge. "Go ahead for Titus," he said after he depressed the talk button. "Titus, there's an active shooter at the high school." "Titus, I'm getting 100 calls a minute here. I think. "Titus, my nephew's there," Cam said. He sounded strange. Titus realized he was crying. "Cam, call all units. Have them converge on the high school." Titus shouted into his mic, "My nephew is there," Cam said. "Call all units. Do it now." Cam groaned, but when his voice came through the speaker this time it was smooth and resolute. "Got it, Chief. Calling all units. Active shooter at Jefferson Davis High School. Repeat, active shooter at Jefferson Davis High School." Titus dropped the greeting card and sprinted for the door. "What's going on?" Albert called after him as he barreled out the back door. But the only answer he got was the sound of the screen door slamming against the jamb as the autumn wind caught it in its chilly grip. Titus was already gone. 2. There is a sense of chaos that can seem to move with its own order. When a chaotic situation becomes rote, there are certain patterns that emerge from the repetition. As Titus came screaming into the parking lot of Jefferson Davis High on 2 wheels, he observed these distinct behaviors as they unfolded like an origami sculpture moving in reverse. Students and teachers were pouring out from every point of egress of the huge brick building. They were running out the front door. They were slipping out the side doors. They were jumping from the windows. Some had slipped out the back through a metal roll-up door that was the exit and entrance for Mr. Herndon's auto mechanics class. The tide of students and teachers poured past and around his car like a river passing over and around a stone. Their faces were etchings from a Francis Bacon painting, shadowed by a memory that 10 years from now would make them burst into tears at a baby shower, in the middle of the grocery store, after watching a commercial for an exercise bike. This was the first part of the chaos of this particular type of event. The unrelenting atavistic panic that sprang forth from the deep recesses of the animal part of our brains. Fight or flight went from an abstract concept in health class to a necessary component of survival. Titus hopped out of his SUV with his gun drawn. The screams of the children were like a storm cloud moving east to west. Their cries were thunderclaps that shook him down to his heels. He looked to his left and saw 2 of his deputies drive over a shallow ditch that ran parallel to the front lawn of the school. Davy Hildebrandt was driving one patrol car and Roger Simmons was in the other. Carla Ortiz was just seconds behind them in the DRE van she drove to the middle and elementary schools. Roger hopped out carrying a riot gun. Davy had his sidearm drawn. Carla had hers as well. Roger was running toward the crowd of teenagers. He was holding the gun by the stock with the barrel pointing toward the sea of bodies coming toward him like a rogue wave. "Roger, gun up! Gun up!" Titus yelled. Roger stopped and stared at him. He blinked hard, then looked down at his hands. Titus saw him tremble like he'd taken a shot of whiskey, then he raised the gun so the shortened barrel was pointing up in the air. "Davy, get everyone across the road! Across the road!" Titus screamed. Davy holstered his gun and started waving to the kids and the teachers and began herding them across the road into a pasture that belonged to Oakfield Farms. A few Angus cows grazed haphazardly in the field. They seemed nonplussed despite the screams of terror echoing through the crisp early morning air. "What do we do, boss?" Carla asked. She'd sliced her way through the crowd and was standing at Titus's side. Titus saw a red pickup truck with an emergency light attached to the roof come flying into the parking lot. Tom Sadler was in the truck. He was off today but must have heard the call on his scanner. There were only a few more members of the Charon County Sheriff's Office that weren't here today. Titus prayed they wouldn't need them. He prayed the shooter didn't have an AR-15 or an AK-47 or some other machine designed to deal out death in bunches like a spreader tossing seeds. "We move in and clear the building," Titus said. He grabbed his mic. "Davy, get Tom to watch the crowd. You come on back and help us clear the scene. You got your vest on?" The radio crackled when Davy responded. "Sure do. I'll get Tom." "Come on with it, Davy," Titus said. He motioned for Carla to follow him as he began to move through the stragglers and headed for the school. "He shot Mr. Spearman," a slight blonde girl said. Titus registered she was Daisy Matthews's daughter. He'd graduated with Daisy. Her name was Lisa. "Get across the road!" Carla yelled. "Who shot Mr. Spearman? What does he look like, Lisa?" Titus asked. Lisa turned her head and gazed at him like she'd just noticed his 6'2" frame had appeared. I don't know. He was wearing a mask. He shot him in the face." "Oh my God, he shot Mr. Spearman." Lisa's eyes were as wide as tractor wheels. She wasn't crying, but her face was pulsatingly red. Titus knew the tears would come later. Either tears or screams in the night. Was he tall? Taller than me? What about his clothes? What was he wearing? Titus said. Lisa closed her eyes and fell against Carla. "I don't know," she screamed into Carla's shoulder. Titus took a breath. He realized he had been yelling. A deep-voiced police officer yelling in your face never produced pertinent information. He knew this, preached about this to his deputies, and yet he'd done it anyway. Titus touched his mic. "Suspect is wearing a mask. That's all we got." "Let's move in," Titus said. "Honey, I'm gonna need you to go across the road, okay?" Carla said as gently as she could. Lisa didn't respond but took off for the pasture like a startled gazelle. "Okay. Let's go," Titus said. This was the other half of the tradition born from chaos that resembles order. Guns drawn, men and women walking toward a man, it's almost always a man, with his own gun drawn, the barrel still hot from spraying a classroom or a theater or an office full of cubicles with chunks of lead in steel jackets moving at 2,600 feet per second. Titus felt his stomach tighten so hard and so fast it was like a cramp. His breath was slow and steady, but his head was pounding. The wind picked up and cooled the sweat wicking into his collar. Rays of sunlight reflecting off the windows were muted by his sunglasses as he moved forward. His feet crunched across the asphalt. The sound was polyphonic in his ears. To his right Carla was taking deep sharp breaths. To his left Davy was emitting a sort of keening noise like a bleeding lamb. Roger was taking point. Titus could see the muscles in his thick shoulders knotted up like coils of deck rope. In the past 15 years Charon County had notched exactly 2 murders. One was solved in 15 minutes when Alice Loney confessed to stabbing her husband, Walter, with a pitchfork after she'd caught him sleeping with their next-door neighbor Ezra Collins, Pip's cousin. The other one was unsolved, and if Ward Bennings's file notes were to be believed it would remain that way for time immemorial. The victim had been a white male, aged 21 to 45, found sliced in neat sections inside a suitcase that had washed up on Fiddler Beach. Conventional wisdom said the remains had come in from the Chesapeake Bay on a strange tide that wouldn't come again. Folks liked to say Charon wasn't a place where terrible things like that happened with any regularity. Titus thought folks had short memories. Charon's recent history was indeed relatively quiet, but the past held horrors and terrors that had moved into the realm of legend. His father would sometimes share a quote from one of Reverend Jackson's fire and brimstone sermons and say that Charon was long overdue for a season of pain. Titus didn't think Gideon had the gift of prescience, but he did believe in the rise and fall of time. That what had happened before would happen again. The wheel spins and spins and eventually it lands on the same number it landed on 20, 30, 40 years ago. No matter what they found inside the school, the season of peace had passed. Now the season of pain had returned, on his watch. They were about 50 feet from the front steps of the school when the doors opened and a man carrying a leather mask with a wolf's snout in his left hand and cradling a .30-30 like a newborn in the crook of his right arm walked out onto the top step. The man wore a weathered black peacoat buttoned in the middle and dirty blue jeans. His hair was twisted into fuzzy cornrows that needed to be redone. His mouth was frozen in a grimace that seemed to take over his whole face. For a moment the world was calm again. The sounds of the crowd were snatched out of the air by the breeze. It was just the morning sun, the blue sky, and this man that Titus recognized peering down at them. "Luttrell, put down the gun!" Titus roared. The time for the inside voice had passed. Luttrell turned his head toward Titus. The fact that 5 police officers had 5 guns pointed at him didn't seem to disturb him at all. His smooth brown face was eerily calm despite a golf ball-sized bruise on his right cheek. Pupils the size of pinpricks assessed Titus with a profound impassiveness. Titus figured it was the effect of either oxy or heroin. Both were plentiful in Charon despite his best efforts. Luttrell was here and not here. He looked like a toddler who had escaped the watchful eyes of his parents and who did not yet know he was in fact lost. Titus knew Luttrell's parents. Calvin and Dorothy McDonald. He'd gone to school with Calvin. He and Calvin and Patrick Tynes and Big Bobby Packer had brought Charon their one and only state football championship. Calvin was a wide receiver to Titus's quarterback. The night of the championship, Titus had lost his virginity in the back of Calvin's Ford Mustang with Nancy Tolliver. She liked being choked, but Titus couldn't bring himself to do it. Not back then. He used to wonder how a 17-year-old even realized she liked erotic asphyxiation, until he realized he didn't really like any of the answers to that question. Nowadays Calvin worked at the shipyard in Newport News. He was coming up on 25 years there. Dorothy was a nurse's aide at Pruitt Nursing Home. They had another son, a 12-year-old named Levon. Luttrell was their oldest and their most troubled. In the year since Titus had taken office, he'd arrested Luttrell once for possession of drug paraphernalia after he was kicked out of a 7-Eleven for starting an altercation about not being allowed to purchase beer after midnight. That night he'd appeared much as he did now. Disheveled but mostly harmless. Except that night he hadn't been carrying a long rifle and a leather mask. When Calvin had bailed his son out, all he'd said to Titus was that Luttrell was messed up. Titus had sensed his old friend had wanted to say more. Yearned to say more. But instead, he'd collected his son and kept his own counsel. Titus had watched them leave, fully aware Calvin was struggling with Luttrell's demons. Titus was also aware that he was no longer a shoulder for his former teammate to cry on or a listening ear for him to share his problems. The badge on his chest had slammed that door shut. It seemed whatever demons Luttrell were battling had multiplied tenfold. Luttrell. Drop the gun, Titus said. He enunciated each word with as much clarity as his tongue could muster. He wanted to break through whatever fog had enshrouded Luttrell's mind. He needed him to hear him. He needed him to see the guns trained on him. He needed him to realize that, whatever he'd done, he could still leave this place upright. This was Calvin's son. And even if he had been the son of a man Titus didn't know, he still deserved that opportunity. A man Titus hadn't drunk moonshine with or run 2-a-days with for 4 years. A man Titus hadn't grown up with under the shadow of that giant Confederate flag out by the county line. He's one of the archangels, Luttrell said. His timbre was tremulous but loud and clear. Luttrell, I'm going to need you to put that gun down and get down on the ground, Titus said. He said he was the Black Angel. Angel of Death. Mr. Spearman used to say he just liked to hear himself talk, Luttrell said. Titus watched as tears trickled down Luttrell's face. Luttrell, you need to put that gun down now, Titus said. He said it loud and clear, but the threat had ebbed. This didn't need to end with bullets. He made them call out for God. Then he'd tell them he was the Malik al-Maut, the destroyer. But that wasn't true either. He was just a sick motherfucker, just like Mr. Spearman, Luttrell said. He dropped the mask and put the barrel of the rifle under his chin. Titus stopped. He lowered his gun a fraction of an inch. He didn't want Luttrell to pull the trigger, but he knew how quick someone could go from suicide to murder. The words coming out of the young man's mouth could be dismissed as the ravings of a broken mind. Yet, Titus saw the agony that wound its way through Luttrell. It twisted his body. It contorted his limbs. It was as if his arms and legs were being pulled and drawn by the weight of a guilt and shame Luttrell couldn't properly articulate. His hands gripped the rifle with manic desperation, fingers undulating in and out like the tentacles of a deep-sea creature who had no knowledge of the sun. Luttrell, listen to me. Whatever's happened, we can talk about it. Whatever you've done, this isn't the way to fix it. Put the gun down. Please. Put the gun down and let's talk. It doesn't have to be this way, Titus said. He took one hand off his gun and held it palm up toward Luttrell. Through his splayed fingers he watched as Luttrell gingerly removed the barrel from beneath his chin. That's it. Now put it down on the ground and walk toward me, Titus said. He changed the orders he had given Luttrell because he didn't want him to be within an arm's reach of that rifle if he changed his mind. Madness was coming off him in waves like heat rising from asphalt in the middle of July. Put the gun down, bitch. Roger screamed. Deputy, stand down. Titus yelled back. Luttrell closed his eyes. No, Titus murmured. You don't know the things I've done. I tried to stop, and they said they'd kill my little brother. The angel, he never took off his mask. But Mr. Spearman, he liked for them to see his face. He liked that a lot, Luttrell said. The words came out in one long sentence like a chant. Luttrell, wait, Titus said. Luttrell opened his eyes. Check his phone, he said. Titus lowered his gun one more fraction of an inch. Luttrell held the rifle above his head. I have become death, he howled as he tore down the steps toward Titus and his deputies. Later, as Titus replayed the scene over and over again like a film on loop inside the theater of his mind, he'd come to this part in the movie and pause. The moment would become a turgid series of movements that seemed hidden by an opaque sheen. Had Luttrell pointed the rifle at them? Had he begun to point the rifle at them? He'd close his eyes and strain for the memory, but it dissolved even as he grasped it, like a cobweb. Titus heard the first shot before Luttrell had taken his third step. Buckshot from Roger's riot gun turned half of Luttrell's head into a red mist. Tom Sadler popped off 5 shots from his .357 Smith & Wesson 6-shot. Tom was an excellent marksman. All 5 bullets found their target in a tight grouping in Luttrell's chest. "Hold your goddamn fire!" Titus screamed at the top of his lungs. Davy hadn't fired a shot yet, but he holstered his gun so quick it might have been a magic trick. Carla pointed her sidearm down but held onto it with a tactical grip. Davy was muttering, but Titus couldn't make out the words. The gunshots were still echoing in his ears. Luttrell's body rolled down the last 9 granite steps of Jefferson Davis High like a rag doll discarded by a child. The .30-30 clattered to the ground far out of his reach, as if that mattered anymore. As Luttrell came to rest at his feet, Titus saw the trail of blood his journey had left behind. It stained the steps with streaks and slashes like rose-colored calligraphy. 3. They found Mr. Spearman at his desk. He was leaning back in his chair with his mouth agape and his tie askew and the tail of his gray mullet spilling over his collar. Anyone who'd taken 9th grade geography in Charon County in the past 30 years was familiar with that frazzled blue tie with the Rorschach-inspired coffee stains. If a poll were taken at Jefferson Davis High asking who was your favorite teacher, Jeff Spearman would most likely have come in at number 1 for 25 out of his 30 years as a member of the Jefferson Davis faculty. If it weren't for the dime-sized wound in his cheek and the cavernous hole in the back of his head, you could be forgiven for thinking he was taking a nap. The section of the blackboard that was directly behind Mr. Spearman was painted in bits of bone and clumps of brain matter and gray hair. The pieces were held in place by a patina of blood. Titus thought that part of the blackboard resembled an arts and crafts project inside an abattoir created by a lunatic. Titus went over to the body and put 2 fingers on his neck. There was little doubt Jeff Spearman had shuffled off his mortal coil, but Titus believed in being thorough. In college in an anatomy class, he'd read about a man who had taken a 2-foot iron rod through his brain during an industrial accident and driven himself to the hospital. Clear the rest of the school. Room by room. Go, Titus said. No one moved. The fuck he shoot Mr. Spearman for? Davy asked. The hurt in his voice made Titus wince. He wondered about that himself, but the time for questions would come later. Right now they had to secure the scene. Fucking terrorist. Hear what he hollered when he came at us? Some Islam shit, Roger said. He was breathing hard, like a bull. Titus spun on his heel and stepped inside Roger's personal space. We don't know anything about anything yet. We don't know why he did it or if he even did it. Maybe he has an accomplice. Maybe Mr. Spearman shot himself and Luttrell just picked up that rifle. Maybe we are dealing with terrorists. Maybe we are dealing with someone with a mental health issue who should never have had access to a rifle that can take down an elk. We don't know shit. So, what we're gonna do is secure the goddamn scene. Now go. I'm not gonna tell y'all again, Titus said. He used a plural noun but he was talking to Roger. He stared into his eyes until Roger dropped his head and turned away. Roger moved toward the door to the classroom. The rest of Titus's deputies followed him. He and Davy shared a brief moment of eye contact before Davy too headed toward the door. And what he was yelling wasn't Arabic. It was Aramaic. Don't make any assumptions about what's happened here, Titus said to the empty room. An hour later they were in the parking lot joined by ambulances and fire trucks and throngs of terrified parents searching for their traumatized children. Dozens of husbands and wives holding their spouses, many of whom had probably logged their last day as an employee of the Charon County school system. Coming face to face with the possibility of your imminent demise forces you to reckon with the career path you've chosen. They both need to go to the me, a large, light-skinned man asked Titus. He was from the funeral home. Virginia was still a largely rural state, interspersed with medium-sized cities surrounded by great swaths of forest and nestled in the bosoms of hills that were just a few feet shy of being mountains, and mountains that were old when the pyramids were new. Even large counties like Red Hill or Queen didn't have a local coroner's office. The state appointed a local doctor as a medical examiner. This medical professional pronounced unattended deaths. Aunt Emma dead in her bed after swallowing a peanut the wrong way, or Mama Jane finally succumbing to a stroke as she canned peaches for the fall. Anything that could be called natural and expected was handled by the local medical examiner. People with bullet holes went to Richmond to be dissected by the state medical examiner's office. Yeah, both of them gotta go, but Maynard's is gonna take Spearman, Titus said. The light-skinned man nodded and bent down to grab the stretcher with Luttrell's body on it. He squeezed a lever and stood at the same time. The foot of the stretcher came up with him. He went to the head and repeated the action. Once he made sure everything was locked and loaded, he started pushing the stretcher into his van. "Hey, hold on a minute," Titus said. The funeral home attendant paused. Titus unzipped the body bag. "Can you give me some gloves?" Titus asked. The attendant leaned into his van and then tossed him a pair of black latex gloves. Titus put them on and opened Luttrell's coat. He ignored the sickly pungent scent of voided bowels and the metallic aroma of spilled blood. A memory so powerful it felt like a hallucination tried to force its way into his mind, but he held it at bay by focusing on Luttrell's body. He unbuttoned the man's coat. There was a bleeding honeycomb in the center of his sternum. He went through Luttrell's pockets with a practiced thoroughness. After a few moments he found Luttrell's phone. Luttrell had mentioned Spearman's phone in his ramblings. Had they been communicating before the shooting? One way to find out was to let the body go to Richmond and let the evidence sit in a drawer for 4 weeks. Another was to take Luttrell's and Spearman's phones back to the office and go through them. "Carla, get me an evidence bag out of my truck," Titus said. Carla nodded and jogged over to his SUV. When she came back, Titus dropped the phone in the evidence bag. "You can take him now. Carla, tell Maynard that Spearman can go too, but check and see if he has his phone on him first," he said. He dropped the "Mr." Luttrell was a broken soul with troubles he couldn't begin to imagine. He was also a thief, a drug addict, and could be an irritating nuisance anywhere in the county he happened to appear. Common sense said Titus shouldn't trust a thing Luttrell had to say. Common sense said if Luttrell McDonald told you it was raining you should probably stick your head out the window and see if it got wet. But Titus couldn't reconcile common sense with the look in Luttrell's eyes when he'd started talking about archangels and Jeff Spearman. The darkness in those eyes that expanded like a black hole as he ran at them screaming about the angel of death contained no lies. Titus knew that for a fact. Knew it in his bones. His instructors at the FBI Academy would have chided him for that kind of thinking. "Gut feelings are full of shit," Bob McNally, his behavioral science instructor, was fond of saying. That idea, that only empirical evidence had any investigative value, was a philosophy that Titus had espoused with enthusiasm at the Academy. That same idea was shown to be as fragile as new ice on a pond, when you were in the field. Evidence makes convictions, your gut gets you to the heart of the case. Ezekiel Wiggins, the only other black agent in the Indiana field office, was fond of saying. Titus thought the truth was somewhere in the middle. Evidence could be tainted. Your gut could lead you astray. You had to find a balance between technique, intuition, and the truth. The truth here was that Luttrell had walked into Jeff Spearman's classroom, shot him, then walked back out and died on the same steps he'd been running up 4 years ago as a senior. The evidence was in the rifle, in Jeff Spearman's cranium, and maybe on Jeff Spearman's phone. Titus, what the hell is going on here? The sound of Scott Cunningham saying his name made Titus want to grind his teeth like a grist mill. He took a breath and turned to face Scott. "There was a shooting, Scott. I'm gonna need you to get back behind the tape," Titus said. Scott put his hands on his hips and jutted out his chin. Titus had seen him do this at Board of Supervisors meetings when things weren't going his way, which in all honesty wasn't that often. "Who was shot?" "See, this is why I've been saying we should let the teachers arm themselves," Scott said. Scott, I'm gonna tell the whole county everything I can once we get the scene cleared and get the shooter and the victim moved and their families notified. But right at this moment you're in the middle of my crime scene stepping on evidence, and I'm gonna need you to step back. Now, Titus said. Scott looked down at his feet. He was standing in the middle of a puddle of Latrell McDonald's blood. God damn it. Shit to hell, Scott groaned with disgust. He took 2 large steps backward before scraping the soles of his shoes on the grass to the side of the front steps. Behind the tape, Titus said. I'll expect a full report, Scott said. He waited a beat before he started walking back to his truck. Titus knew he wanted to make it seem like it was his decision to leave. Scott, you're the chairman of the board. You're not my boss. You'll get the same report the rest of the county gets, Titus said. Scott blanched, then just shook his head. I'm not your enemy, Titus. Liar, Titus thought. When Titus had announced his candidacy, Scott Cunningham had thrown all his considerable influence behind Cooter. Titus knew Scott's reasons for supporting Cooter had nothing to do with Cooter's law enforcement philosophy, which in its purest form could be articulated as harass black and brown people and anyone who voted Democrat. It had everything to do with Scott's desire to have his own personal puppet in the sheriff's office. A sheriff who wouldn't look the other way, per se, but perhaps could be counted on to squint when the need arose. And what better marionette than the son of the former sheriff? A man best known for 3 things: roughing up teenagers caught necking down at the river, shaking down folks for cash or weed during traffic stops, and once getting into a fight with a goat. If you got Cooter the slightest bit tipsy, he'd regale you with stories about how the goat suckered him with a headbutt out of nowhere. The goat, as was the tendency of victors, didn't comment on the altercation. When the election results had come in, Titus was nearly as shocked as Scott. In the past year they had butted heads more than Titus thought was necessary for a county the size of Charon. Things really reached a turning point when Titus arrested Alan Cunningham, Scott's cousin and the county building inspector. Jamal Addison had made a complaint that Alan was denying well permits for black families without cause. Titus had investigated and found an almost comically inept conspiracy between Alan Cunningham and Reese Cantor, a local real estate developer. The two had conspired to keep black families from building homes on land that Reese coveted near the Conyers' beach for a new subdivision. Alan had received a kickback for each refusal. Scott had been the titular figurehead for the collective rage of the Cunningham family, but there was nothing he could do for his cousin. Whether through arrogance or stupidity, Alan had left a paper trail wrong way Corrigan could have followed. Titus didn't usually enjoy arresting people, but slapping a pair of bracelets on Alan Cunningham had been the highlight of his week and the nadir of his relationship with Scott. And I'm not yours. I'm also not one of your cutters at the flag factory or one of your crab pickers at the fish house. My department will handle this. You wanna help? Get the board to approve some funds for counseling for everybody that was here today. You do your job and I'll do mine, Titus said. He turned his back on Scott and took the evidence bag from Carla. On any other day the constant dick-swinging contest that Scott Cunningham was convinced they were both participating in wouldn't garner a second thought from him, but people had died this morning. Their bodies were still warm even as their blood cooled on the steps and the walls of Jefferson Davis High. Men like Scott, men consumed by their egos and their desire to assert dominance at the top of hierarchies only they could see, didn't have the capacity to set aside their petty aspirations even in the face of death. They craved power and control in any quantity or amount they could find. Titus thought you could offer Scott the job of head shit shoveler at a manure farm and he'd take it if it meant he got to tell someone else what to do. Scott's small-town megalomania was fed by equal parts hubris and tradition. The Cunninghams were one of the biggest families in a county where they owned the 2 largest companies that were the county's 2 largest employers. By most metrics they ran Charon County. Except one. Titus was the sheriff and they weren't, and today, of all the days since he'd pinned that badge on his chest, was not the day he was going to indulge their futile fantasies. If Spearman has his phone on him, bag it up too and take them both back to the office, Titus said to Carla as he handed her the evidence bag. Carla had been his second hire behind Davy. She was a short slim woman who had a blue belt in jiu-jitsu and dreams of joining the FBI herself. Davy was friendly and loyal, but Carla was smart and tenacious. One day in the future Davy might be sheriff himself. One day in the future Carla might be halfway across the country leading cartel members on a perp walk. Got it, boss. I'll take care of it, Carla said. She paused. This is gonna get bad, isn't it? The shoot, I mean. Most of those kids back there were recording it. I thought he was surrendering, then it looked like he was running at us. I mean, that's what it looked like, right? Carla said. Right now I just need you to get that phone. We'll deal with everything else later, Titus said. Carla nodded and went off to rifle through Spearman's pockets. Behind his mirrored sunglasses he closed his eyes and ran his tongue over his teeth without opening his mouth. How long would it take for one of the kids or staff members' videos to go viral? A day? An hour? At the final debate before the election, he and Cooter were given a chance to make their case one last time to the citizens of Charon County with a closing statement. Titus had gone up to the lectern in the cavernous East Charon Ruridan Club and shared a fraction of his guilt disguised as a personal mission statement. George Orwell wrote that we sleep safe in our beds because rough men stand ready in the night to visit violence on those who do us harm. I just want a sheriff's department that makes sure those rough men don't visit violence on the people they are supposed to keep safe. I was born here, graduated from high school here. Grew up swimming in Fiddler Bay, learned to drive on Route 15, had my first taste of liquor over behind the watering hole. Charon is my heart and my home, but I know that those rough men have not always been judicious with their violence. I think the least a sheriff can do is make sure those rough men are bound by the same rules they are sworn to enforce. Because we all know it hasn't always been that way, Titus had said. As far as closing arguments went, he'd thought it was rather eloquent, especially since Cooter's final statement had consisted of ursine grunts that sounded like a bear trying to say the words law and order and border control. Even though Charon was 2,000 miles from the southern borders. When Titus had returned to his seat a few people clapped, but everyone had listened. Now his rough men had visited violence upon Latrell McDonald. Latrell had visited violence upon Jeff Spearman. But could there have ever been any other outcome? In Titus's penance-driven mind he'd thought so, but now he realized that was the height of naivete. You pick up an axe, you're going to chop down a tree. You pick up a gun, whether you are wearing a star or not, eventually you're going to chop down a man. Titus knew that was always a possibility. The algorithm of law enforcement made it a near inevitability. That didn't make it any easier to reconcile the fact that he held the power of life and death. When Jamal Addison had first approached him about running for sheriff after Emmett Thompson had gotten pulled over by Cooter Bennings and ended up being beaten to within an inch of his life, he'd gone to the cemetery to talk it over with his mother. Under the mournful pine trees that stood sentry over his mother's grave he'd sworn that he'd change things. Change himself. He'd seen what the width of the thin blue line could hide, and it sickened him. Almost as much as what he'd done, no matter the provocation, sickened him. He'd run for sheriff with the weight of a promise to a spirit on his shoulders. And in the end his deputies had killed a man whose mind was held together by a delicate amalgamation of heroin-induced fever dreams and moonshine. A man who was suffering. A man who had needed his help. Titus walked over to his SUV and slid behind the wheel. He started the car and immediately put it in gear. There was paperwork to fill out, there were phone calls to make. He had to notify Latrell's parents. He was going to do that personally. He couldn't hand that off to anyone else. He hoped to God he could get to Calvin and Dorothy before they saw the news online or, even worse, someone called them. He'd have to find out who to notify about Spearman. The school would obviously be closed for the day, and probably the rest of the week. The walls and steps would have to be scrubbed clean of gore. The exorcism by bleach and water would wash away the carnage but would have a minuscule effect on the consciousness of every person who'd walked the halls this morning. He was going to have to pull Roger and Tom into the office. That was a given. Hundreds of moving parts were now set to begin locking into place like rusted gears in an old engine. Any or all of those parts could bite him in his softest places. But that knowledge wasn't the only thing paramount in his mind. He also wanted to see what was on Jeff Spearman's phone. 4. By the time he got back to the sheriff's office, news of the shooting was burning through the county like a fire in a tinderbox. Titus could hear Cam answering call after call from his desk. As soon as he ended one call another would sound, and he'd answer with the generic response Titus had told him to use in case of a mass casualty event. Yes, there has been an incident at the high school. At this time, we cannot release any more information. The sheriff will provide an update as soon as possible, Cam said again and again in his weathered rawhide rasp. Titus pointed to his own ear, then pointed at Cam. Cam removed his headset. He pushed an errant strand of dirty blonde hair out of his eyes. "My nephew," was all he said. The words came out clipped and harsh, as if he were already preparing himself to speak about the boy in the past tense. "He's fine. There was only one casualty besides the shooter," Titus said. Cam sat back in his wheelchair and closed his eyes. Relief, that voraciously selfish emotion, washed over his entire face. "The board is blowing up. I can keep up but just barely. Maybe we should record a message on the 911 line about the shooting? Might cut down on the calls," Cam said. "That's a good idea." "I'll do it now," Titus said. What happened over there?" Cam said. He'd put the headset back on and opened a bottle of water. "You know Calvin McDonald? His son, Latrell, shot Jeff Spearman with a .30-30. Then Roger and Tom shot Latrell," Titus said. He didn't try to explain how he'd attempted to disarm Latrell or how he felt Roger and Tom had been a half-second too quick on the trigger. "Jesus H. Christ. Mr. Spearman's the nicest teacher I ever had. He used to give me a ride home after basketball practice. My folks only had one car, and my dad used that for the night shift at RNJ, goddamn, man. We got any idea why?" Cam asked. Before Titus could answer, the board went off again. "I'm gonna go record that message," Titus said. He went into his office and shut the door. He hung his hat on a peg on the wall that was level with the top of the frosted glass in his office door. Easing down in his chair, he considered how quickly what's important can shift and transform. A week ago, the biggest thing on his immediate radar was Ricky Sowers and the Sons of the Confederacy planning a parade to protect a statue that no one was seriously talking about removing. Granted, he would shed no tears if someone reduced Rebel Joe to a pile of crushed pea gravel, but the Sons parade was a grievance in search of a reason. Now he was going to have to record an incoming message letting folks know they had killed the man who shot a schoolteacher in front of his students. Ricky Sowers and his band of neo-Confederate apologists were sandcastles washed away by the incoming tide of Charon County's new reality. That reality was as simple as it was traumatic. They were now the latest locality that had to add site of a school shooting to their town's history. Titus started to open his laptop when a scowl crossed his face. "Cam, you been in here?" Titus yelled. "I needed a pen." Cam yelled back, "Next time don't move the laptop." Titus yelled in response. "Sorry, boss," Cam said before answering another call. Titus adjusted the laptop so that it was back to its usual 90-degree angle perpendicular to his pen holder and the telephone. There was also an ink stamp embossed with his signature to his left and a yellow legal pad to his right below the laptop. Much like his closet and his personal truck and, despite his father's best efforts, the kitchen cabinets, Titus's desk was rigidly organized to a degree that bordered on obsessive. He wasn't always so consumed by order. After his mother died when he was 13, he became possessed by a desire to give his life structure. Partly because his daddy had crawled into a bottle of JTS Brown and wouldn't emerge for the next 2 years, and partly because he craved a new type of religion. The one based on blood and wine magic had failed them, in Titus's opinion. Structure became his religion. Discipline was his crucifix against chaos. But there were moments like today when the true nature of existence was revealed to him. Moments when the ephemeral curtain of divine composition was pulled away and entropy strode across the stage. For all his attempts at control, days like today, when he'd seen a boy he'd known since infancy get his chest cratered, reminded him that chaos was the true nature of things. The DeCrane family could attest to that. Chaos was king. Titus sighed. He would keep setting the pieces of his life in straight lines. It was all he had. It was all that brought him a modicum of peace. Titus opened his laptop and scrolled to the voice recorder app. He cleared his throat, clicked, and spoke in his calmest, most succinct manner, recording a straightforward message and assuring the town that there were no active threats. He pulled up the emergency system administrative page and added the file to the incoming message. Then he went to the Charon County Sheriff's social media page and typed the same message and pinned it to the top of the page. Performing these tasks, steeped in mundanity, always felt strange after he'd had to pull his gun. Writing reports seemed hopelessly inconsequential in the aftermath of holding someone's life at the end of the barrel of his gun. Yet he knew from first-hand experience that writing the reports was the most important part. It was the record of how you upheld or dishonored your oath. In a perfect world that record was sacrosanct. But Titus knew the world was much less than perfect. The phone on his desk rang. "Hello? Calvin McDonald is on line 1, Cam said. "Shit," Titus said. "Okay, put him through." He rubbed his forehead with his thumb and forefinger. "Sheriff Crown," Titus said. "Is my boy dead, Titus?" Calvin asked. He breathed in deep gasping swallows of air. "Calvin, where are you?" "I'm in my truck. Dorothy called me. Said they was saying Luttrell had shot up the school." "Calvin, can someone drive you home? I want to come over and talk to you," Titus said, knowing as soon as the words left his mouth, they confirmed Calvin's worst fears. But Titus said them anyway, even if they felt hollow as bird bones. He was not going to tell Calvin about Luttrell on the telephone. The man deserved to see his face. "Is my son dead, Titus?" Calvin sobbed. It was a frank and uncomplicated sound. The sound of all hope being lost. "Calvin, go home. I'll meet you and Dorothy over there in an hour," Titus said. Calvin moaned. "Ah, fuck. Fuck you, Titus." The line went dead. Titus put the handset back in the cradle. There was going to be more of that. A lot more. He was prepared to take it, but that didn't mean he liked it. He opened up the reports tab and started detailing the shooting from his perspective. Roger and Tom would have to write their own reports. In an effort to encourage more accountability, he'd instituted a rule that deputies couldn't discuss the details of any ongoing investigations, including deputy-involved shootings. He didn't want to give the appearance of impropriety or give anyone a chance to get their story straight. When he finished, he went back into the dispatch area. Cam was still juggling calls. Titus pointed to his ear again. "Yes, ma'am, the message is correct. That's all the information we have at this time." "Bye, now," Cam said. He removed the headset and let out a sigh. "The message might have saved us from maybe 2 less calls," Cam said. "I'm going over to Calvin and Dorothy's place. Do you still have Tom's number?" "I got it in my phone if you don't," Titus said. "Yeah. He gave it to me when we had that cookout at his place in June. Give him a call. Tell him I need to see him by 4 today." Tell him to bring the gun he used at the school, Titus said. Cam looked down at his desk, then raised his eyes. It was a good shoot, right? I mean, you said he killed Mr. Spearman, Cam said. The statement hung in the air between them, ensconced within Cam's unspoken assumptions. There had been a bad man who had shot a good man, then other good men had killed the bad man. What more was there to talk about? Titus wished it were that simple. He really did. I need to talk to him, Cam. Pass the message along, Titus said. It was no longer a favor. Titus got in his SUV and slipped out of the parking lot of the sheriff's office and onto the road that wound its way through downtown Charon County, past the Safeway and the Dollar General, past what used to be Herndon's Furniture and Appliances. The road took him by the county library and Gilby's Southern Dining, then past the courthouse building and the Confederate War Memorial that stood not 10 feet from the front door. Past the high school, the parking lot a ghost town after this morning. Past Soapy Sud's car wash, the third most profitable business in Charon County. Lots of boys liked to take their jacked-up trucks mudding on Friday night and drove through Soapy Sud Saturday morning to cruise the back roads and tear up and down Route 15 Saturday night. Finally, Titus drove past what was once Summers Pharmacy. Titus had arrested Billy Summers for prescription fraud 6 months ago. When he'd gone to the house with Davy and Carla, they'd found Billy sitting in his den with his wrists slit down to the bone. A pearl-handled straight razor was in his lap and a picture of his wife and 2 boys was in his hands. His café au lait carpet looked like someone had spilled a carafe of Merlot. They'd tied him up with tourniquets and ferried him to the hospital in Newport News, then arrested him proper 2 weeks later. A new pharmacist had tried to take over the Summers building but Billy's cousins, still stinging from his arrest and subsequent conviction, started a rumor she didn't really have a degree, and within a month the rumor was an immutable fact, and by the fall the young woman who tried to help the good people of Charon with their medicinal needs soon lit out for greener pastures. Titus thought the fact that she'd been a black woman hadn't helped to endear her to the white citizens in the county. Normally the black folks in Charon would have tried to rally around a sister taking on a new venture, but the young lady wasn't a native of Charon. She was a come-here, and people in Charon were loath to cotton to new faces. In this the citizens, both black and white, were united. Titus escaped the bonds of the 35-mile-per-hour speed limit in town and stepped on the gas as he turned onto Route 15. The road sliced through most of the teardrop-shaped county like an incision, with side roads that broke off from the main highway like asphalt stitches. Titus passed First Corinthian Methodist Church. A sprawling edifice encased in bright red bricks, First Corinthian was where a lot of the white folks on this side of the county went for Sunday service. A few miles down the road he passed Second Corinthian Methodist Church. The result of a schism in the First Corinthian congregation, Second Corinthian was not as large as her mother, but what she lacked in square footage she made up for in garishness. Stained glass windows stretched from the foundation to the steeple. A fountain large enough to swim laps in dominated the green space in the front of the building. The church sign, a billboard framed in stonework that advertised salvation with clever quips and pithy proverbs, was a good 10 feet tall and festooned with golden cherubs. Titus thought the members of Second Corinthian missed the part about the meek inheriting the earth. First and Second Corinthian and the New Wave Temple were 3 of the 21 churches in Charon County. When he was growing up there had been 19 churches in the county. His mother had been a member of Emmanuel Baptist Church. She'd taught Sunday school until her illness forced her to step down, then it forced her to lie down, then it made her go still. Before it took her speech, she would say that a place like Charon didn't need such an overabundance of salvation. God can be everywhere at the same time if he wants, but he ain't in every building that calls itself a church. You can stand in a pulpit and call yourself a minister. I can roll around in mud and call myself a pig too. Don't mean you was called to preach, and it don't mean I was meant to be pork chops, he'd heard her say on more than one occasion. Then she'd laugh and laugh. When he was a boy, he'd thought his mother's laugh was full of the prettiest notes he'd ever heard. It had been a high and sparkling sound, like something Mozart might riff on a harpsichord. All these years later, nothing had come along to change his opinion. After 15 more minutes of driving, Titus turned onto Salt Lick Lane and headed down to Calvin and Dorothy's double-wide. When he'd first come back, before he announced he was running for sheriff, he'd come down here in his father's truck and sat on the back deck with Calvin and passed a mason jar back and forth and spoken of people they'd known and memories they'd shared. Of good times they'd had that seemed in Titus's mind to be bathed in a sepia tone as they faded bit by agonizing bit. Once he'd put on the star, the invites had faded away as well. Titus couldn't say he hadn't expected it, but he was hoping this was one time he was wrong. Titus saw Calvin's truck parked at a haphazard angle as he pulled into their yard. Dorothy's little two-door sedan was parked in much the same way. Titus could see them pulling in hard, slamming on the brakes, and rushing toward the house. The grapevine being what it was, they'd heard 15 different versions of how their son had died. None of them correct and all of them sickening. Titus walked up to the door and knocked hard 3 times. Calvin had bricked in the double-wide a few years ago, turning the mobile home into an actual house with 4 pallets of baked red clay. Footsteps came to the door in frantic rhythms. Calvin tore open the door and locked eyes with Titus. "Say it. Say it to my face, motherfucker," Calvin croaked. "Calvin, can I come in?" Titus asked. Calvin was a few inches shorter than Titus but twice as wide, with a wide head on a bull's neck. He still held the Jefferson Davis high deadlift record. His dark brown face had a few more wrinkles around the eyes, but for the most part he still looked like the foul-mouthed, irreverent kid Titus had known since first grade. "You can stand on that step and tell me you killed my boy." "I already know, Titus. I just want to hear you say it." "I want you to look me in the eyes and say," Calvin trailed off. For a half-second he just went quiet. The light in his eyes dimmed and Titus could tell he was somewhere else. Some place where one of his best friends hadn't killed his child. Then he came back with a vengeance. Tears streamed down his face. He grabbed his head with both his hands. Sobbing, he stepped backward away from Titus and bumped against the wall. His legs gave way and he slid to the floor. Dorothy appeared like an apparition and went to his side while keeping her gaze on Titus. "What happened, Titus?" she asked. Her jaw was set in a rigid line. Dorothy was a slim woman, but she put her arm around Calvin and helped him to his feet. A sentiment passed between her and Titus, as invisible as electricity but just as powerful. She wore the expression of a person who has prepared themselves for the most awful thing they could imagine every day of their life. Titus took off his sunglasses. "We got a call that someone was shooting at the high school. When we got there, Luttrell came walking out with a .30-30 in his hands. He didn't put it down. He said some things about Jeff Spearman, then charged at us," Titus said. A sour taste crawled up from the back of his throat and settled in his mouth. Calvin and Dorothy exchanged a pained look. Titus picked up on it like a hound dog catching a scent. "Was that .30-30 yours, Calvin?" Titus asked. Calvin looked toward Dorothy again, but his wife had closed her eyes. Calvin whipped his head back in Titus's direction. "You gonna arrest me now?" Calvin barked. His grief had emerged from its cocoon and become anger. "No. I was just asking. Just trying to get things straight, that's all," Titus said. He put his sunglasses back on and stepped back onto the second riser. He fought the urge to explain. To tell them how he tried to talk Luttrell down. Tell them how he hadn't wanted this to end with half of Luttrell's head splattered across the parking lot. When he was in school Mr. Spearman had been his favorite teacher. He'd even given Luttrell extra help with his geography classes. Used to keep him after school and tutor him. "Why would he want to shoot him, Titus?" Dorothy asked. Titus swallowed the lump trying to form in his throat. "He didn't shoot him. They setting my boy up. That's what they do." Calvin said. Spittle flew from his lips. Titus felt a few drops land on his cheek. Another silent conversation took place between him and Dorothy. Her eyes told him things about Latrell Calvin didn't want to accept. No one knows the hidden rivers of a man's spirit like his mama. Cal, we didn't set him up. Nobody in my office gave him that .30-30, Titus said. He did his best not to saddle the statement with an accusatory tone. He was just speaking facts. People who said facts don't care about your feelings had never had to tell a father his son was dead and before he died he'd become a killer. All the fight seemed to seep out of Calvin abruptly. Without warning, he turned and walked away. Titus watched as he ducked into the living room and disappeared from sight. That left him and Dorothy standing in the doorway with the cold stealing the warmth from their bodies. A few weeks ago, he came here with a machete. Was swinging it all around, hollering about how he was the devil. Scared the hell out of us. Had Levon crying. Then he dropped the machete and fell in my arms. He was hurting so bad, and I didn't know how to help him. He was my son, and I didn't know how to help him. We had thought he was doing better, you know? He'd gotten a job at the fish house. We thought he was getting himself together. Dorothy hugged herself against the cold. When can we get him? He's at the medical examiner's right now. It'll be a couple of days. We'll be in touch with the funeral home. I'm assuming y'all gonna use Spence and Sons? Titus asked. I hadn't even thought about it. Yeah, I guess we'll use Spence. Did he hurt anybody besides Mr. Spearman? Dorothy asked. Titus shook his head. No. No one else. Not the kids and not any other teachers. That's good. I'm gonna go check on Cal. Then I guess we'll figure out how to tell Levon his brother is dead, Dorothy said. She closed the door. Titus stood there for a few seconds before heading back to his SUV. There was so much more to say, and at the same time there was nothing he could say that would stanch the wounds Calvin and Dorothy and Levon would carry from this day until their last. As Titus was starting his truck his mic squawked. Sheriff, what's your 20? Carla said. Making the notification for Latrell. What you got? Carla didn't respond. Titus felt his phone vibrating in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at it. It was Carla. He hit the answer button. Something you want to talk about you can't discuss on an open channel? Titus said. He heard heavy breathing on the line like some obscene phone call from the 80s. Sheriff, we have the phone but we can't get into it. It's locked. It's got one of those thumbprint security apps. I called Harold at the funeral home. He still has Spearman's body. He was going to run him up to the me, but he got caught up with some folks who wanted to order a headstone for their mama. I was calling to ask if you wanted me to run over there and see if I can use Mr. Spearman's fingerprint to open the phone. But what, Carla? Sheriff, Jamal Addison is in the parking lot with about 20 people from his church. They asking for you. They asking why we couldn't take Latrell alive. They asking if he was really the shooter. Davy went out there to try and talk to them, and it didn't go well, Titus said. Not at all, Carla said. Tell them I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't go to the funeral home just yet. I might need you and Davy, Titus said. He hated the fact that he even had to acknowledge the possibility that things might get out of hand. Jamal was a dynamic pastor who was as passionate about social justice as he was about saving souls. He inspired intense devotion among his congregants. That intensity coupled with the righteous, and sadly justified, skepticism of the veracity of anything the Charon County Sheriff's Office said under Titus's predecessors mixed with the raw emotions that were still being processed by everyone across the county after today's event set the table for a volatile situation where words could quickly become actions and those actions would invariably be violent. Titus didn't think Jamal and his folks wanted that to happen, but that was the thing about violence. It didn't always wait for an invitation. Sometimes it saw a crack in the dam and then it flooded the whole valley. For his part, Titus didn't want to see anyone else get hurt today. He'd had his fill of both the sound and the fury. 9 minutes later, Titus was driving past a small crowd waiting for him as he pulled into his parking space at the sheriff's office. Jamal Addison and 20 or so of his congregants were standing near the entrance to the drab brick building that housed the sheriff's office and one holding cell. Titus rolled his head from left to right like he was loosening up before a fight. He knew this conversation was going to be a different kind of battle, but he was sure he wouldn't escape unscathed. An African-American man had been shot by 2 white deputies. Didn't matter who was sheriff, there were going to be serious questions asked. Titus knew this, and even though some people wouldn't believe it, he agreed with them. The history of policing in America, especially south of the Mason-Dixon, made those questions necessary. He also knew Jamal wasn't going to like the answers to those questions. He would see them as the language of conspiracy. Didn't matter that Titus was a black man who had run on a platform of reform. To a lot of black folks, including Jamal, he was now blue instead of black. That Jamal thought this way was both ironic and disheartening. When they had discussed the possibility of Titus running, he'd gone to great pains to ensure that Jamal realized he was going to be a sheriff who was black, not the black community's sheriff. He'd told Jamal he'd do everything he could to enact real change, but at the end of the day he couldn't and wouldn't ignore the law. Unfortunately, he'd failed in his attempt to make him understand that idea. Or maybe Jamal felt Titus had used him to get in office and had now betrayed him. It certainly felt like that was Jamal's position. Either way, it weighed on Titus every time circumstances brought them together that ultimately only served to drive them further apart. As for the rest of Charon's black community, he understood that for some of them he would always be the enemy. It was the price of wearing the badge. The moment he announced his candidacy he had made a choice to live in a no-man's land between people who believed in him, people who hated him because of his skin color, and people who believed he was a traitor to his race. He tried his best to stand on the border of that undiscovered country, bloodied but unbowed. For most of the past year he thought he'd succeeded. Then a day like today slapped that notion into the dirt and all he could do was watch it shatter at his feet. He couldn't blame that on Jamal. That was the nature of the beast. And that beast liked to bite. Titus got out of his SUV. He nodded to Carla and Davy. They were standing on the other side of the concrete island that separated one row of parking spaces from another. The crowd was on the side closest to Titus. When Carla and Davy didn't move, he nodded again, this time more forcefully. Carla got the hint and nudged Davy. He could see Davy's face was beet red. They both disappeared through the front door. Titus wanted them nearby but he didn't want them standing guard outside. If things went sideways, they were only a few steps away, but he didn't want Jamal and his people to feel like they were in a standoff. "Sheriff Crown, can we have a moment of your time?" Jamal said. He was a handsome young brother with a booming voice. He had the tone and mannerisms of an old-school pastor but the vision and passion of a millennial activist. A lot of the older black folks in the county didn't cotton to his long braids or his casual attire. Jeans, brown Timberland boots, and throwback football jerseys weren't how they expected a minister to dress. Titus thought Jamal's wardrobe was a welcome change. He actually preferred that to the pimp/prophet outfit some pastors wore these days. "Reverend Addison. What can I do for you?" Titus had noticed that Jamal stopped referring to him by his first name around 6 months after he'd been elected. Titus decided he should probably do the same. If a man decides you aren't his friend, then you look like a fool trying to hang on to that title. Jamal put his hands together as if he were going to pray. He took a moment to gather his thoughts. "Sheriff, we've been told there was a shooting today at the high school. Calvin McDonald called me crying and said your department had killed his son. Now I'm hearing that he is suspected of shooting Mr. Spearman, and I'm also hearing that he was about to surrender when he was shot down like a dog," Jamal said. He spoke slowly and with such deliberate pronunciation Titus knew he was enraged. "Reverend, the shooting is still under investigation. The 2 deputies involved will be placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. I'll be making an official statement tomorrow. But I can assure you that every effort to resolve the situation peacefully was made," Titus said. He hated the way that sounded. It was like he was code-switching with another black person. Jamal put his fingertips to his lips. "Sheriff, I'm sorry, but frankly that's not good enough. Can you assure us right here and right now that the state police will be called in to investigate this shooting? I mean no offense, but if you catch a fox in a henhouse, you don't get other foxes to investigate his intentions," Jamal said. A gentle murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd. "As of this time I don't feel it's necessary to have the state police carry out the review. I give you my word we will employ complete transparency in regards to, your word ain't shit, Oreo." Titus recognized the young man standing next to Jamal who said it. The name on his driver's license was Irvin Jameson, but everyone called him Top Cat. Until 6 months ago he was one of the main recreational pharmaceutical reps in Charon County. Then he'd overdosed on his own product. When he came back to this side of the veil after a week in a coma, he pronounced himself saved. He'd seen the other side and he'd glimpsed where he was going. He joined up with Addison's church not long after that proclamation. Titus didn't doubt the veracity of his conversion. He knew from first-hand experience how coming within kissing distance of the Grim Reaper can change you. What annoyed him about Top Cat was the overabundance of self-righteousness he now possessed. It was a trait common to the recently saved. Especially if one suffered from some form of dependency in their previous unsaved life. It was like they traded a secular addiction for a sanctified one. "I don't think I heard you right." "Say that again," Titus said. He was tired and stressed and his mind was reeling from all he'd seen this morning. One of his best friend's sons was killed in front of him. A teacher who had written a letter of recommendation for him to attend UVA had his brains blown out the back of his head. And now his blackness, a thing that was as intrinsic a part of him as his arms and legs, was being challenged by a man who 6 months ago was selling more Oxy and Molly to his own people than he sold to the Tylers and Madisons of the county. The audacity was palatable. The hypocrisy was infuriating. "Say it again," Titus said. He didn't use his cop intonation this time. It was all backroad Charon County in his voice now. "Moonshine and cornbread. Fistfights and honeysuckle." "You heard me," Top Cat said, but this time with the volume turned way down. "Irvin, it's okay. Sheriff Crown, I hear you, but do I have to really explain to you why we might be a little doubtful?" Jamal said. Titus cocked his head to the side just a bit. In many ways what Jamal was saying was worse than Top Cat's insult. Of course he understood why Jamal was doubtful. Of course he was aware of the long history of bias and bigotry that persisted, not only in the Charon County Sheriff's Office but in many police departments across the country. Of course he'd grown up seeing Ward Bennings wielding his badge like a mace that he pressed on the neck of every black man, woman, and child in the county. Titus wanted to grab Jamal by the collar of his old-school Houston Oilers jersey and yell at him, "Why the fuck do you think I ran for sheriff?" But that wasn't the only reason, was it? Red DeCrane's voice whispered in his mind. "Reverend, I understand your concerns. But that's all I can say right now," Titus said. Jamal shrugged his shoulders. "All right. But I want you to know this. We are going to be watching how you handle this review. And if it looks like you're trying to sweep the murder of another black man under the rug, then we are going to make our voices heard, no matter how long it takes. The truth is never out of season, Sheriff." Titus remembered when Jamal was leading a rally to get out the vote for him last year. He wondered when exactly he'd lost the pastor's trust. He understood why he wouldn't trust the police in general, but it bothered him that Jamal and his church didn't trust him specifically. "I give you my word we are going to do a thorough review," Titus said. I guess that's going to have to be good enough for Calvin and Dorothy and their living son right now, Jamal said. Levon, Titus said. What? Jamal said. Their other son. His name is Levon. I was home visiting when he was born. I was the 5th person to hold him after his mama and his daddy and his 2 grandparents. They were afraid for him because he was born with a slight heart defect. Doctors went in and fixed it. Now he's a 12-year-old ball of fire. Likes to draw. Before I was sheriff, I was over at Calvin's for a cookout. Levon drew me a picture of me and his daddy. I know it won't be good enough for Calvin right now. His oldest boy is dead. Nothing is going to change that. Not my promises and not your preaching. Now, if you'll excuse me, Titus said. He brushed past Jamal and his congregants and went into the sheriff's office. Carla and Davy were standing near the entrance to the holding cell. Roger was positioned near the evidence room with his back to him. He had one hand against the wall with his head down. The only sound in the office was Cam's deep voice as he answered the phone. His other deputies were as solemn as mourners at a funeral. One would think this was because they had killed a native son of Charon. And while that may have impacted their demeanor, Titus could tell that wasn't the primary reason for their sorrowful expressions. That native son had killed Jeff Spearman. Geography teacher, coach of the debate team, and sponsor of the drama club. Jeff Spearman, who always seemed to side with the students whenever there was a confrontation between the administration of the high school and the student body. Titus remembered during his tenure at Jefferson Davis High School when the principal had tried to cancel the ring dance. Ostensibly it was because of a mono outbreak, but everyone knew it was because too many interracial couples had made it known they'd be attending the dance together. Jeff Spearman had stood with the students. He'd even threatened to organize a backup dance at the Ruritan Club if the principal canceled the one at the high school. When Titus had shared that anecdote with his college roommate, the kid, who was from Trenton, New Jersey, had asked whether or not Charon was stuck in a time loop from 1958. I mean, it's the year 2000, man, and principals are still trying to protect the virtue of little white girls from the big bad scary black penis monster? Malik, his roommate, had said. Yeah, but Mr. Spearman had our back, Titus had said. Him having your back shouldn't have been necessary, Malik had said. Titus remembered feeling foolish for praising Mr. Spearman. Not because Mr. Spearman didn't deserve it but because the whole situation had been a sad, pitiful anachronism. Y'all come on in the office, Titus said. The 3 of them followed him, silent as stones. He put his hat on the peg and sat behind his desk. Carla, Davy, and Roger stood in a semicircle in front of him. They were all staring at the cell phone sitting on his desk just to the right of his laptop. The phone was face down inside of a tie-dyed cover. Roger's face was pale as the belly of a trout. His lips were slick with spit. Titus thought he might have thrown up recently. Davy had his fist pressed tightly against his mouth. His jug ears were still bright red like he'd been slapped. Carla had her hands behind her back in a military stance. Titus took a deep breath. He could smell the acrid scent of sweat and beneath that, another fragrance. A bitter aroma, both familiar and disturbing in equal measures. Fear. He could smell their fear in the air like ozone before a lightning strike. All of them, with the exception of Cam, had heard what Luttrell had said about Spearman. His plaintive accusations hadn't sounded like the ravings of a madman, not entirely. There were no half measures here. Titus had a feeling that once they opened Jeff Spearman's phone, he would either be a beloved teacher murdered by a mentally ill former student or he would be a monster. Titus knew it was going to be one or the other. There was no middle ground. Taking one look at his deputies' faces, he could see they knew it too. "Where we at on witness statements from this morning?" Titus asked. Carla cleared her throat. "We took as many as we could. Got about 30. A lot of people didn't want to talk," she said. "I tried to get all the adults to make statements," Davy said. Titus took off his shades. Let's see if we can track down a few more. I want to make sure we've got this covered, Titus said. What's there to cover? That fucker shot Mr. Spearman and we took him down, Roger said. His eyes were wild and his words were full of bravado, but his thin lips quivered when he spoke. Y'all go on and get on that. I'll take the phone over to the funeral home, Titus said. Davy and Carla moved toward the door. Roger trailed behind them. Roger, not you. Have a seat, Titus said. The big man stopped and moved toward the wood-framed leather-bound chair on the opposite side of Titus's desk. Carla took a quick look over her shoulder before heading out the door. Titus interlaced his fingers, leaned forward, and rested his forearms on the desk. He looked Roger in the eye. Roger, you were involved in a shooting today. Yeah, and it looks like we killed a crazy bastard, Roger said. He crossed his arms over his wide chest like a child about to refuse to partake of the Brussels sprouts on his plate. Titus went on. As you know, as I explained after I was sworn in, any officer involved in a fatal shooting is placed on administrative leave for at least 2 weeks, Titus said. What? You can't be serious. Luttrell shot Mr. Spearman in front of a whole classroom of kids. Kids we know. Kids you know, Titus. We did what we had to do, and now you putting me on desk duty? Really? You, instead of finishing his statement he suddenly popped straight up out of his chair. Titus studied his deputy with cool, dispassionate eyes. Roger was a big man and he often used that to intimidate suspects, prisoners, and folks racing him for a table at the watering hole. He had never tried it with Titus, in much the same way a coyote won't try to intimidate a grizzly if it's alone. But now he came over to the desk and put his hands palms down as he leaned forward. His huge squarish head blocked out the fluorescent light in the ceiling. You gonna need all hands on deck, Titus. The shoot was good, but it ain't gonna be good enough for Addison and those folks over at that cult of his, Roger said. Titus unlaced his fingers and leaned forward even more. We will need all hands on deck. That's why I need Trey to come back and give this a good look and make sure the shoot was above reproach. If I just ignore the fact that we killed a man on the steps of the high school, regardless of what he may or may not have done, then that will taint this office and our investigation of the murder of Jeff Spearman. Never mind the fact that everybody and their mama was videotaping the shooting from more angles than in a geometry book. I figure those videos are all over Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, hell, there might even be some folks posting to MySpace. It's gonna get rough around here. I don't need nobody thinking we sweeping something under the rug. You mean people like Addison gonna be upset a white cop shot a black kid? You put me on leave, then people are gonna think the shoot was bad anyway, Roger said. Roger, there are some folks that are always gonna think it was a bad shoot because of that reason. We can't worry about them. We gotta worry about keeping our own house in order. That means desk duty for 2 weeks while Trey investigates the shoot and the rest of us see what's going on with Spearman, this phone right here, and Luttrell. When Trey is done, you'll be back, Titus said. Roger straightened. He crossed his arms again. You don't believe any of that shit Luttrell was rambling about was true, do you? You can't. You ain't gonna find nothing on that phone except pictures of Jeff Spearman at Phish concerts, Roger said. Whatever is or isn't on this phone, I don't need you on the road right now. Things are going to be heated. We need to do our due diligence. You can keep your sidearm, but put the riot gun in the evidence room, Titus said. Roger glowered at him. Here it comes, Titus thought. I'm either going to be a black bastard or he is going to go there and drop the N-bomb. He didn't want to fire Roger, but that would be his ticket out the door. A good leader doesn't tolerate disrespect. He'd read The Art of War in college unironically, which set him apart from a lot of the trust fund babies he walked with through the halls of UVA. They read it for style points at corporate meetings. He was reading it for the actual battles he'd face in the bureau. both in the field and in the office. He'd read one phrase over and over from Sun Tzu's seminal tome, even the finest sword plunged into salt water will eventually rust. He couldn't have people around him who didn't respect him. Disrespect was a pestilence. If you let it go unchecked, it would infect the entire department. That was doubly true if you were a black man. No matter how much folks protested to the contrary, their preconceived notions carried weight when they dealt with you. He didn't need Sun Tzu to tell him that. Roger uncrossed his arms. "You making a mistake." "A big one," he said. "You think you're going to see him tonight in your dreams?" Titus asked. Roger's face softened. "What? Luttrell. You think he'll be waiting for you tonight?" "I think he will. He'll be there with half his head gone. Roger, even if I wasn't going to have Trey do an investigation, I'd take you off the road. You can pull your gun 1,000 times, but pulling that trigger is a whole another thing. And before you tell me it's not, I know you threw up before I came in here. It's because of what you're seeing in your head, isn't it?" Titus asked. Roger opened his mouth a crack. His thick tongue appeared, then disappeared. He didn't answer Titus's question. "It's just 2 weeks, Roger. You help Cam on the phones and type up warrants and summonses. It was gonna be Davy's turn this week with summonses, but you're gonna take it for him." "I got some sick leave," Roger said. "Suit yourself," Titus said. Roger turned on his heel and left the office. 10-1 he runs for sheriff in 3 years, Titus thought. His cell phone buzzed in his pocket. He grabbed it and checked the screen. It was Darlene. He touched the decline button. He sent her a text. "Can't talk. I'm okay. We'll call later." He knew she was probably worried sick. She'd told him more than once that she wished he was in another line of work. Being a cop's girlfriend hadn't been her childhood dream. His phone buzzed again. She'd sent him a text back. "Okay. Love you," Titus typed a 2-character response. You too. He did love her. He did. He simply had a hard time expressing it. He realized that made him a walking cliché. The tough lawman who had a hard time sharing his emotions. He was lucky that Darlene didn't blindly accept that cliché. She'd pushed past his defenses and deciphered the vagaries of his love language. To an extent. He hadn't told her everything that had happened in Indiana at the DeCrane compound and, to her credit, she had only asked him once. She accepted that he wasn't ready to talk about it, but he knew she was also quietly confident he would one day confide in her all of his secrets. Titus picked up the evidence bag and headed out the door, bound for the funeral home where Jeff Spearman was currently lying in repose. Luttrell's cell was an old flip phone. It didn't have any fancy security apps on it. They'd be able to pry open Luttrell's secrets with ease. But what kind of secrets were you keeping, Jeff? Titus thought as he started the SUV. Titus didn't have the heart to tell Darlene that no one told anyone all their secrets. Even the people we loved kept pieces of themselves hidden away from the light. If you want to read the rest of the book and support the writer, you can click on the link in the description down below.